If you only take one thing from this entire video, then let it be. Don't be afraid to add more yeast to your focaccia dough. Be more scared of warm temperatures. Gosh, it's hot out. Let me explain why. Most focaccia recipes that don't use long fermentation are very similar. They'll tell you to use around 1 to 1.5% yeast, baker's percentage, and then ferment the dough at room temperature or even warmer before baking immediately. You will see variants of these exact steps in same-day focaccia recipes, easy focaccia recipes, and so on. I know this really well because I used to do that. I recommended these exact steps in my previous focaccia videos. But recently, after reviewing the science and doing a lot of baking on my own, I changed my mind. These days, if I wanted to make a focaccia in a few hours, I'd rather use a lot more yeast, almost 2 times more, and then stuff that dough into the fridge to ferment before baking. I find that this gives me delicious, better tasting results in a shorter period of time. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the science of why this works and how you can apply it with a focaccia recipe you can try for yourself. Hey, Seraphin here, and we've all heard that time is money. But in baking, time is an ingredient. More time is more flavor, and that's why so many bakers love long fermentation. But what if you just don't have the time to do all these wonderful things? This recipe was born out of the most chaotic period of my life to date, a time when I didn't have the ability to neatly plan ahead. I needed a recipe that was both flavorful and reasonably quick, something I could get done in the evenings, nothing longer than 4 to 5 hours. Taking the advice of most bakers online, there was really only one option. Just make a dough with a small amount of yeast and ferment it at a warmer temperature so that it rises quickly. This is the standard way most bakers learn to bake and make same-day or quick recipes. But after doing a little bit of research on the science, I started to question the status quo. And the conclusion I came to was that we should all be putting our bread dough in the fridge more often. However, there is one obstacle in the way of that. The problem is that most bakers think cold fermentation is synonymous with long fermentation. As a result, there are effectively no recipes that use cold fermentation for a shorter period of time. And this is mostly because of a misunderstanding in how cold fermentation works. Enter enzymes. Enzymes are these tiny proteins that basically cut other proteins and starches up. These cut up pieces are what make the bread taste better.
So good.
A lot of the online resources you see will tell you that cold fermentation works entirely based on these enzymes. So, because cold fermentation slows down the yeast, it gives these enzymes more time to work and destroy more proteins and starches inside the dough. This idea was popularized by books published in the early 2000s. It is a neat and tidy explanation for how cold fermentation works, and it also explains why shorter periods of cold fermentation would be useless. If you're not giving the enzymes enough time to work, then well, there's no benefit in filling up your fridge. But this enzyme explanation of cold fermentation is way too simple. It's just not the whole picture. And rather crucially, if you're not using sourdough, yeast fermentation does not lead to as much proteolytic enzyme activity as noted in this paper. So then, what does the full science really say? Beyond enzymes, according to these researchers, allowing the dough to ferment in the fridge could make the bread aroma more pleasant by reducing the off flavors from a process called lipid oxidation. Lipid oxidation products go up when the temperature goes up, so cold fermentation is a way to prevent these off flavors from building up in the dough. Additionally, fermenting the dough in the fridge also increases the yeast production of fruity flavors by getting the yeast to make compounds called esters, which are also found in fruits, flowers, and other nice-smelling things. Given that taste is mostly aroma, these two factors are likely why even shorter periods of cold fermentation could benefit bread flavor. And this was also the conclusion that the paper came to. And so the paper's conclusion is ultimately the basis behind what we're about to do in this video's recipe. In simpler words, I'm adding more yeast and keeping the dough in my fridge. Now, the shortest time that this recipe can be achieved in is about 3 hours. But do I recommend doing that? Well, if you really don't have the time for anything else, then yes, I personally find that even at this level, cold fermentation is beneficial for flavor. This is very subjective though, and I admit it's somewhat subtle when you compare 3 hours of cold fermentation to 3 hours of room temperature fermentation. However, when the overall fermentation periods start to go up, even at 5 to 6 hours, cold fermentation is definitely superior, and it becomes more noticeable the longer it gets. In the end, what I'm really trying to say here is that I think home bakers should use cold fermentation more often, even if it requires adding more yeast. The idea of using more instant yeast is often associated with a bad or yeasty flavor in various ways. However, it's really important to note that yeast itself is also a contributor to good flavor. And although increased yeast concentration was associated with more of certain lipid oxidation products, the majority of them were unaffected. With that being said, taste is very personal and subjective. If you really love the flavor of room temperature fermentation and less yeast, then you should absolutely stick to it. And this might apply more strongly to you if your room temperature is already quite low, such as below 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, as lipid oxidation would definitely be slower at that point. This is like my form of a legal disclaimer for flavor. I'm not a professional authority on your taste buds. It's just what I found from my research and own baking. To answer some comments on my previous videos too, this expedited cold fermentation method is not meant to replace longer fermentation. And I want to state clearly that if you can ferment for longer, you really should. That does make the flavor better. What I do hope this method does, though, is introduce another option for bakers with already limited schedules, because it makes some pretty dang good bread quickly and simply. In a world of perfect recipes, this is one that's pretty achievable for busy people and good enough for me to make over and over again. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into the recipe. Quick note before we get into making the bread, the recipe I'm about to show you is for the 3-hour version of the recipe. If you've got more time for the dough, around 5 to 6 hours, then I suggest lowering the yeast to around 1.5% or around 4 grams of yeast. Then you can follow the recipe like usual and just extend the final proofing of the dough in the fridge. All right, to start with, let's make our Tangzhong. We've already measured out our flour and set that to the side. And now in a bowl, we're going to pour in some hot water just to warm it up. Then after the bowl has heated up, we're going to get rid of that water. We now want to place the bowl on top of a measuring scale. We'll turn the kettle back on, heat up some more water until it's boiling before pouring it into the bowl again. This time we want to measure it out properly, and when the hot water is in the bowl, we immediately toss in the flour. We want to do this as quickly as possible and mix the flour in right after so that it can properly gelatinize the starch granules inside and partially denature the gluten proteins too. This is a pretty quick process. You just keep mixing until the Tangzhong is fully combined. And after that, we're going to put aside the Tangzhong and let it cool. Now, because my weather is super warm, I do like to put it in the fridge for a bit to let that quickly cool down. When it becomes cool, we're going to take out the Tangzhong and then get ready to make our dough. I'm using ice cold water along with the cold Tangzhong because, again, I live in a super warm climate and I want the dough to cool down as quickly as possible. With that, we immediately get to mixing the dough together. Just going around the bowl, adding in the yeast, and then the salt next, giving this a quick mix before we continue. After that, we add in all the water. Just pouring that in, following it with the Tangzhong. It should have fully cooled down at this point and become a large blob like this, so just dump it in. And finally, pour in the olive oil. This recipe doesn't really need a fat because we have Tangzhong for the softness, but I really like to make sure that the flavor of olive oil penetrates the entire dough, and now we mix the whole thing together. You can, of course, do this in your stand mixer, but this process literally takes just 5 minutes by hand. So every time I do this recipe, I'm always too lazy to set up the stand mixer and would rather just treat it as a mini arm workout so I can eat even more focaccia. The initial goal is to get everything combined. The dough will feel dry at the start, but keep going, keep kneading it, and it will get stickier and stickier as the flour hydrates. When it's homogeneous and has become too sticky to knead, we're going to finish this mixing session with about a minute of slap and fold. These are exactly what they sound like. You use one hand like this to pull up the dough and slap it down before folding it over. We just want to do this for a minute and then we're done. The dough should still look like a proper mess. It's not smooth, it's not very cohesive, and it's still very sticky. Perfectly fine. We cover the bowl and stuff it into the fridge immediately. Now my fridge has an average temperature of around 5 degrees Celsius. With that being said, my room temperature is quite high, often approaching 32 degrees Celsius, which is why I find it very important to use very cold water to mix the dough together. This ensures the dough temperature starts off at below 20 degrees Celsius at the very least. This recipe is very forgiving though, so even if you're off by a little bit here and there, it should be fine. Okay, after 20 minutes, it's time to get the dough out and do our first set of stretch and folds. And we want to prepare a bowl of water next to it. Then we uncover the bowl, dip our hands into the water, and do a stretch and fold like so, stretching the dough up and fold it over. Then we turn the bowl and repeat. We'll do a total of 8 stretch and folds here. And the important thing is to make sure to turn the bowl in between stretch and folds so that you are evenly stretching the dough out. This should be very fast. It normally takes me less than a minute or two to be done with it. And after that, we're covering the bowl and putting the dough into the fridge again. After another 20 minutes, we take the bowl out again and do another set of 8 stretch and folds. This is our second and last set of stretch and folds. The dough should feel much better at this point. It should have more resistance to being stretched, and it will also look better. We'll let it bulk ferment for another 45 minutes. When the time's up, before we take the dough out, we want to quickly prepare the baking pan. Now, let me show you what not to do. Do not simply put olive oil on the pan and call it a day. Don't ask me how I know, but this just isn't enough to prevent the dough from sticking to the pan. What you should do, though, is use parchment paper. And to prevent it from sliding around, add a bit of olive oil on the bottom before placing the parchment paper in and tidying that up. Then we want to add a bit more olive oil to the parchment paper, and it's time for us to handle the dough. To start, we just want to coat the dough in olive oil, as well as give it a few folds like this, for gently stretching it out, kind of shaping it, then placing it into the pan. We'll tidy up the edges, pulling them to fit the pan as best as we can. It doesn't have to stretch all the way because the dough will rise and fill up the pan later. All right, it looks good enough here, so we cover it and back to the fridge the dough goes. For this 3-hour focaccia, we want to proof it for about 1 hour and 20 minutes in total. But if you're following the 6-hour version of this recipe, then you would proof it for another 4 hours and 20 minutes in total. For the last 15 to 20 minutes before the dough is done proofing, I do like to take it out and let it sort of come to room temperature a little bit. This lets the glass bakeware warm up a little and makes me feel a little less worried about baking it. It also lets the dough relax. Before it's done, we are also preheating the oven to 230 degrees Celsius. Every oven is unique, so make sure to adjust these settings and the timing to your oven. And when the time's up, we'll do the most satisfying step of a focaccia recipe. First, we drizzle the dough with olive oil, using a generous amount, and then spread it out over the dough's surface. Finally, we dimple the dough like so, just gently making indentations that get filled up with olive oil. Don't go all the way to the bottom, just go down gently until you can feel it, and then go back up. At this stage, you can add toppings or just go with a simple herb like rosemary. It should be light and bubbly. And then we are ready to bake. We'll put the dough into the oven, and we're going to bake with the top heat set to 180 degrees Celsius and bottom heat set to 220 degrees Celsius for about 15 minutes before lowering the temperature to 150 degrees Celsius top heat and 200 degrees Celsius bottom heat for another 5 to 10 minutes. This setting gives you a nice and even golden brown shade with a crisp bottom crust, but if you'd like a darker char, then you can bake about 15 to 20 minutes straight at 210 degrees Celsius top and bottom heat. If your oven doesn't have separate settings for the top and bottom temperatures, then you can also try out baking on bottom heat only for the first 5 to 10 minutes before turning on the top and bottom heat. And with that, we are done. This focaccia is so good, crispy, fluffy, and perfectly soft. It is so satisfying to eat, and the Tangzhong along with the olive oil allows it to stay soft for days on end. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and bye!